The date is October 7th, 1781. As the winds of autumn draw upon the 13 colonies, a bitter battle is being fought at Yorktown between the Allied forces of George Washington, along with his ally Rochambeau, and the British soldiers under Charles Cornwallis. On the night of October 6th, Washington had ordered his men to secretly dig a long, straight trench called a parallel, little more than 1,000 yards from the British lines, where cannon could be positioned. Work began swiftly, and the French and Americans labored long into the night, under the cover of darkness. At first light on October 7th, the thunderstruck British saw with amazement and horror that a long trench had been dug by the French and Americans during the night, no more than 1,200 yards from Yorktown's fortifications. Their horror continued to grow, however, as the cannon began arriving in the parallel over the next few days, capable of firing projectiles directly into Yorktown itself. By the 9th of October, all the French and American guns were in position, and at 3 p.m., the French opened fire into the harbor, pounding back a British frigate across the York River and forcing it to be scuttled to avoid capture. At 5 p.m., Washington himself went to fire the first American shot, and following his signal, all 14 of the American cannon roared out at once in the direction of Yorktown, pounding the British positions mercilessly. The ferocious bombardment soon proved to be brutally effective. British fortifications were torn to pieces, and many defenses were smashed, while their guns were silenced one by one. Washington ordered his cannon to fire on through the night, thus keeping the British from making any sort of repairs. By morning, Cornwallis was left in a position where he could do nothing but watch as the damage done to Yorktown and its defenders began to pile up. The French and American guns fired on for 2 more days, wreaking havoc in not only Yorktown, but also in the harbor, where British ships were pounded and sunk. But despite the detrimental effects the bombardment produced upon Yorktown, Washington was still not satisfied, and decided that he could place even greater pressure upon Cornwallis. On the night of October 11th, Washington gave orders for his men to begin work on a second parallel, no more than 600 yards away from Yorktown, which was point-blank range for cannon. However, it could only be built halfway, since the 9th and 10th British redoubts blocked its path to the river. All that night, as the French and Americans labored to dig the trench, the bombardment of Yorktown from the first parallel waned in no way, and the British was unaware that a second parallel was being dug. By the following morning, the joint army had moved forward to the new positions. Over the next 2 days, the second parallel continued to be extended, but it soon became apparent to Washington and Rochambeau that without clearing the 9th and 10th redoubts, they could not place the necessary pressure upon Yorktown. On the 14th of October, Washington ordered the 2 British trenches to be pounded as much as possible by French and American guns, and when night fell, he unleashed a secret attack upon them. The assault was laid out like this. Redoubt 10, which was closer to the river, would be assaulted by 400 Americans led by Alexander Hamilton, while Redoubt 9 would be attacked by 400 French soldiers led by the Count of Dupont. Additional orders were given from Washington enforcing silence upon all soldiers until within range of British fortifications. At 6:30 p.m., the French launched a diversionary attack on the Fusilier redoubt on the British right flank, while the bombardment of Yorktown intensified to keep the Redcoats occupied. At the same time, Hamilton and his men advanced on Redoubt 10 with bayonets fixed, while sending additional troops behind the British position to keep them from fleeing. Reaching the redoubt, the Americans began hacking through the wooden fence that protected the British positions. The Redcoats quickly formed up into a firing line and poured musket balls into the ranks of Hamilton's men. The Americans were unhindered, however, and they pierced through the wooden defenses and clambered over the earthen wall to enter the British trench. Though the Redcoats came on them with loaded muskets, Hamilton and his men overwhelmed them with sabers and pistols. A bayonet charge smashed the rest of the British in the redoubt, and the entire garrison was captured. At the same time, the French opened up their assault on Redoubt 9. At first, they had trouble piercing through the well-made defenses, and they got caught in a wide ditch, as the Hessians who formed up the garrison of the redoubt fired upon them. But at length, the French regulars clambered out and fired a volley into the trench, driving the Hessians back, and when they climbed over the earthen walls and threatened a bayonet charge, the Hessians laid down their arms and surrendered. With the capture of redoubts 9 and 10, Washington was able to extend the second parallel all the way to the shores of the York River, and by morning, the Allied forces had begun to bombard Yorktown from all three sides. The French and American cannon devastated the British position even more brutally than the first parallel had, smashing houses and lighting fire everywhere within the town. By nightfall on October 15th, Cornwallis' situation had become desperate, and as a last attempt to slow the Allied advance, he ordered a sortie of about 300 redcoats, led by Colonel Robert Abercrombie, to storm parts of the enemy line and to destroy or disable as many cannon as possible. Abercrombie and his men caught the French and Americans off guard, and they were able to damage multiple cannon along the second parallel without much resistance. However, a French detachment soon came and drove the redcoats swiftly from the trenches and all the way back to Yorktown. By morning, all the damaged French and American guns had been properly repaired, and the furious bombardment resumed as usual. The British sortie, though courageous, had done nothing in the end to improve their situation in Yorktown. Cornwallis had now dropped all hopes for victory, and the Allied fire only intensified as that day drew on. In a last attempt to break free from the siege, he tried to evacuate his men across the York River to Gloucester Point, where he could attempt to force a way through the French and American lines and flee into Virginia. But as the redcoats were being ferried across, a storm rolled in furiously, which made the evacuation impossible. Cornwallis, standing amidst a starving and battle-worn army, and with the Allied fire only intensifying by the hour, at last recognized the truth that his situation was hopeless and decided that further battle would be useless. On the morning of October 17th, negotiations for surrender opened up between the two sides. Cornwallis requested to have the traditional honors of war in the surrender, but Washington firmly refused, saying that he would give the British no more honor than they had given the Americans at the siege of Charleston a few years before. Cornwallis, though unwillingly, nonetheless consented to Washington's terms. On October 19th, the surrender ceremony commenced. The British and the Hessians marched out from their camp with furled standards and shouldered muskets, watched by the French and Americans on both sides, and they cast down their weapons in large piles. Cornwallis sent a subordinate to surrender his sword to Washington at the ceremony, instead of going himself, claiming that he was ill. In all, the French and Americans captured 8,000 soldiers, 200 artillery pieces, and thousands of muskets and various other equipment. It was by far the most stunning victory Washington had scored yet in the entire Revolution. The Battle of Yorktown is often known as the last major battle of the 7-year-long war, for the surrender of Cornwallis was the final blow that caused the British Parliament to agree to seek a peaceful resolution. Following the victory at Yorktown, Washington stationed his army in New Windsor, New York, where he remained until the signing of the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the American Revolutionary War.